What are peak femboy Venti's biggest pros and cons? That's what I'm here to tell you today. My name is Juice, and let's get into it. So we all know that Venti's in a rough spot to say the least when it comes to his meta value. However, as how I normally do in these videos, I'm gonna kick things off with all of his biggest pros before we delve into the cons. Right, when it comes to strictly the meta, I'd say that his greatest quality is how situationally useful he is. What I mean by this is that while 95% of the time he's not going to be that relevant in the Abyss, for the Abyss is where he is good, gosh darn, this dude absolutely shreds endgame. Anybody remember how Venti had 5 seconds of fame during the Mizuki Shield Abyss? There is a good reason as to why Genshin doesn't do heavy mobbing Abysses anymore. And why they will always try to regularly avoid doing those if they can, because they're always going to end up as Venti shill. You see, most people totally gave up on this guy post Inazuma, but because I'm the #1 Venti coper, I continue to use him beyond that point too. So something that a lot of folks don't know is that it doesn't even have to be a heavy mobbing situation in order for him to work. Don't get me wrong, those are obviously his bread and butter, or I suppose for this particular femboy, wine and apples. But essentially, he can group up a very random selection of enemies, shadowy husks, Sumeru desert Doritos, water eidolons, you get the idea. His grouping isn't only limited to merely extremely small foes, it tends to be the robot enemies that screw him over. There was also that one time where Hoyoverse nerfed Spectres, so they became groupable within Venti's burst. Same for other Inazuma enemies such as Kairagi. So for Abyss scenarios where the chambers just feature a whole lot of generally groupable foes, he works very well. But in those mobbing Abysses, dude, he obliterates every other available option, like the absolute femboy goat that he is. Imagine if this guy pulled up to you and you're a groupable enemy. It's over for you, buddy. This isn't even mentioning how he's actually useful for some very strong modern characters, meaning that he isn't just locked to his archaic old synergies. His ability to lift up enemies in the air and hold them in one place can make for a fun Kinich setup, where he blasts enemies within the air to nuke them all down at once, making up for his single targetness. Not to mention how if Venti swirls pyro, then burning is even easier to sustain thanks to all of that pyro application. Plus, Venti's personal swirl damage thanks to pyro swirls being pretty strong. Or how he can work with Mr. Settle Down, as that lad is able to use his Hydro Pump up in the air, reaching foes within Venti's lift range. Those two are actually a really solid combo when the synergy actually works. He's also an extremely good AoE teammate for Scaramouche, but sadly, because of how boss-centric the Abyss is these days, you rarely ever get to reap the benefits of his synergy, but it does work when he can group. So essentially, this creates a scenario where if you're a player that has all of the key versatile supports that make an account great, and you have all of the more specific units that you want to support your favorite teams, then Venti ends up being a decent luxury pull to act as a major convenience for those occasions where he actually works. It's advisable to go for unit constellations over picking up Venti in complete honesty. Especially when Shilonen is running right next to him, a character that has a busted C2, but if you feel like your account is geared out enough, then perhaps the occasional convenience will feel worthwhile to you. I consider this next point to be one of convenience as opposed to meta, because Imaginarium Theater is genuinely so easy. It's a how many units do you have built check, not a how many characters have you invested in well check. Horizontal over vertical, for those of you familiar with such terms. However, Venti is a great character for Imaginarium Theater when Animo is allowed as one of the elements. Each character has only 2 uses, so you can't just say Kazuha and call it a day. Good grouping is actually useful here, and there's going to be more than 2 stages where you're going to want that. I seriously wouldn't pull a unit just for freaking Theater of all game modes, but it's undeniable that Venti is one of the better feeling units in it, so if you plan to get him, then he'll serve you well there when he's allowed. It's kind of a bummer that you can't consistently use him due to the element restrictions that are in place, but if a stage permits it, Venti is a great way to beat down the mobbing stages quickly to save energy for your other supports that can help take down the boss stages. Then I want to talk about this dude's general convenience factor. Floors 9 through 11 usually feature a lot of mobbing, but with the Abyss 9 to 10 skip existing these days, this use of it has become more redundant. But if you're able to use him in floor 11, then he's a pretty convenient unit there. Otherwise, he's excellent in the overworld. I typically dislike recommending burst-based units for the overworld, but this guy ascends with ER, has a dirt cheap burst cost, and builds a whole ton of ER in general, so really you'll be fine. You'll get his burst back immediately after any enemy encounter. His hold skill is pretty handy for Oculus collecting in some of the regions, as the updrafts tend to be nice for getting up to hard to reach places. All in all, this really contributes to his convenience factor. Venti's got a passive which can offer flat elemental energy based on whatever element he absorbs in his burst, plus 15 flat energy for himself, emphasizing the point that I stated earlier. This means that in teams where you regularly use Venti, you can afford to build less ER on your teammates. With that being said, because you use Venti so inconsistently, this pro isn't really that big of a deal because it's not worth building your units around the character that you're going to be using so occasionally, unless you're like me, who shoves him into random situations because you think he's real cute. Treat this passive as something extra, something that can help you out on top of what's already built. Don't build your character's ER requirements around Venti, unless you only ever intend to use them with them. Alright, time to tear apart the cutie patootie. You see, one of the most obvious marks against this unit is the fact that the current meta landscape just seriously doesn't suit him. The only time that Hoyoverse ever does those more AoE-centric mobbing abysses anymore is when they're trying to sell a weak character, such as Mizuki. But because single-target DPSs are all the rage these days, especially in Notlon, the Abyss basically never caters to him. Before, I did have the point that the Abyss used to always have at least one AoE half, where even if his grouping wasn't as good as the mobbing abysses, his pull together would still work. For example, if there were Abyss Selectors in the Abyss, Venti can pull them together very efficiently, and if you're able to absorb the element that they're weak to with his burst, then their elemental shields whittle down very quickly. This is a very practical use case for Venti in the modern day, but sadly, you'll have a situation like that, and then the other two chambers that come afterwards are pure boss chambers. Gone are the days of the Abyss having one definitive AoE half and one definitive single target half. There have been many single target only Abysses at this point, with minimal AoE, and any AoE-centric Abysses are the exception, not the norm. So unfortunately, while he can indeed be practical at times, like I said earlier, the practicality is very situational. You're seldom ever gonna see him see consistent use, which sucks. Also, that's not even mentioning how due to this, you can just pull for the 5 billion ever supports that suits the current meta landscape far better. Kazuha is the one that people usually cite when comparing to Venti, but I'd argue that the Abyss is seeing less and less of a need for really strong grouping as time goes on, so you could even cast your gaze to the DJ cap that he'll be running on banners with, Shilonen. There's genuinely so many supports that you could opt to pull for, you don't have much reason to pick up Venti in particular. Plus, I mentioned how he's good to get if you have all of the key and niche supports that you want. That kind of speaks for itself in my opinion. Essentially, this game has an insanely large cast at this point. Getting a luxury pull like Venti when there are so many supports to collect, it just seems unrealistic unless you're a mega-based huge fan of the character. Me too, dude, me too. But man, this is me talking in the context of 5-star supports. I haven't even yapped about how 4-star character constellations are a thing too, because let's not pretend like getting a C6 4-star in 2025 is an easy task. That is a falsehood of the highest order. So unfortunately, he's very easily skippable in favor of all of the meta units that we've been thrown recently. For example, Moik and Sit Lolly ran at the same time. It's fairly likely that a good chunk of people missed out on one or the other, and are waiting for their reruns. Generally, there are better pulls to prioritize. Another issue of Venti that isn't really prevalent in most Abyss cycles, but is prevalent in the overworld domains or theater, is the fact that some units in the game can't reach within Venti's burst. This won't be an issue if you're trying to group shadowy husks, lectors, or any other more large enemy with him, but in mobbing scenarios, some abilities such as Shangling's burst won't be able to hit within his ult. It's an annoyance for sure, but because of how rarely Venti's burst ever gets the chance to truly shine at 100% potential, you don't experience this issue too often, but you do in its best install scenarios, so it's still a relevant con. Alright, seriously, you can tell that this femboy was the first ever unit that Hoyoverse ever released in Genshin, because what in the world are the poor dude's constellations? Jeez, Hoyo, what have you done to my lad? Early Genshin cons have always been quite the specimens, that much is for sure. But Venti's constellation lineup? Yikes. Literally just yikes, dude. Why don't we look at some of the worst defenders here? C1 is literally just for physical Venti enjoyers. I mean, literally how many of those even exist, dude? I think physical Venti went extinct with the Saurians. Gotta love how C2 provides an extremely small res shred effect that you can replicate for free with some other characters. Also, physical res shred, be honest, how many Eula mains are actually sticking Venti on their teams? Based ones, but you get the idea. C4 is just worthless in a day and age where damage bonus percent buffs are literally everywhere. So while this is a neat bonus, it sure isn't C4 worthy. C6 is what a C2 should be. It was a lot better back in 1.0, sure. But compared to other C6s that we have in Genshin, this isn't all that good. His weapons are fine. In fact, Elegy for the End is still a very good, valuable pull even to this day. But his constellations, to put it into perspective, my second favorite Genshin character is everybody's beloved Lady Farina, and she's C6 R1. So why is my first favorite Venti C0 R1? Simple. Because making someone pull for Venti cons will be a way of trying to get top secret information out of them. The wastefulness is gonna feel like a torture method in of itself. So if even I, the Venti lover of all time, is refusing these cons when all of my other favorites have copies, yeah, that should Archon darn speak for itself. The final con that I have to speak of in regards to this lad is only for us Venti copers that refuse to stop using him no matter what. You see, if you want to land this burst swirl upon bosses, you have to time it right and hope that the boss target doesn't dodge his burst, so he can actually land the swirl hit. If the boss isn't static at all, then you're sort of cooked. You can still make it work of course, but it's a whole lot of extra hassle to go through in order to see a femboy on your screen. Worth it, man. Meta-wise, this guy should be chronicled. The fact that he hasn't been banished to that banner yet just goes to show how Hoyo values their Archons, but sadly, there's no real way for them to boost Venti's performance without totally reworking his kit. My suggestion is that Hoyoverse should do what they did in HSR and ZZZ, or they make 5-star forms of characters and release them. I know that it'd be weird for them to re-release an Archon, and that also just opens the floodgates to, oh my goodness, is there gonna be a 5-star form for this or that? But the poor lad is just kind of beyond saving at this point. Regardless, I still love the guy, and I do think that people tend to overlook his positive qualities because everybody wrote him off after Inazuma, but from Sumeru to Fontaine, he's actually been fairly competent. He's only recently become mega bricked now that Nautlon's abysses have been even more anti-Venti. I will say that Genshin Impact is still an open world game at the end of the day, and convenience-wise, he does definitely still feel like an Archon, so for those reasons, you might find him to be worth it. I still think that he's the finest darn femboy that I've ever seen in my life. My dude is unparalleled in that role. I will admit that I'm more of a lighter Lorenz and Mighty fan these days, but honestly, I'm still a huge fan of the guy. He'll always hold a special place in my heart as the one who was my favorite character of all time for 4 years in a row. But what do you think about Venti? Will you be pulling for the greatest femboy of all time? Or are you cringe? Sorry, I meant, is it a skip on your end? Let me know down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. As always, I have a ZZZ second channel. Head on over and subscribe if you're interested in some fun, silly ZZZ content. I'd also like to mention that I stream on Twitch. I stream once a week every week on Saturdays, started from free PUK time. Come along so that we can play Wuthering Waves, ZZ, and do some other fun stuff together. Hopefully this video was able to tell you Venti's biggest pros and cons. This has been Juice, signing out, and remember that a femboy a day keeps the sadness away.